The hum of the clippers wasn't just a sound. It was a violation. It vibrated through the very marrow of Kayla Brooks' 12-year-old bones, a monstrous metallic insect trapped in the stale air of Classroom 7B, its buzz drilling directly into her skull with sadistic precision. Each microscopic tooth of the cold steel felt like a separate tiny knife against her tender scalp, even before the blades began their brutal harvest. She sat ramrod straight, a small, rigid soldier facing an executioner, the coarse fabric of her hand-me-down uniform scratching her skin, a minor irritation compared to the inferno of shame consuming her from within. Tears hot and fierce welled, blurring the disdainful face of Miss Margaret Pierce, who loomed over her like a predatory bird. Kayla blinked them back, a desperate, silent battle waged in the arena of her own heart, a fight against the public unraveling of what little dignity she possessed. A tremor ran through her, an involuntary shiver that had nothing to do with the autumn chills seeping through the ill-fitting window frames. It was the body's protest, the soul's recoil. Miss Pierce's reflection smirked from the grimy window pane, a distorted, almost demonic caricature of authority. Some students, Kayla, her voice was a low, satisfied purr that amplified the clipper's drone, simply refused to learn. Rules are rules, you understand. They apply to everyone, even for charity cases, who seem to believe they merit special dispensations. The words were barbs, each one finding its mark, twisting deeper into a wound, already festering from months of similar, albeit less public, torments. The classroom was a tomb of suffocated silence. 30 pairs of eyes, usually restless and prone to mischief, were now fixed, transfixed, a gallery of youthful faces, contorted by a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and a dawning, helpless shame. No one protested. No one dared breathe too loudly. The air thinned, becoming heavy, almost viscous, with the unspoken terror of the students and the palpable contempt of the teacher. Emily, Kayla's seatmate, the usually chatty girl with bright pink streaks in her hair, bit her lips so hard, Kayla could almost taste the metallic tang of blood herself. Emily's hands were clenched, white-knuckled on her desk, her gaze fixed on Kayla, a silent scream trapped in her wide, horrified eyes. Then a subtle shift in the oppressive atmosphere. A shadow long and incongruous fell across the doorway, momentarily eclipsing the dull light from the hallway. A man, his suit a bespoke slash of muted charcoal gray, an undeniable emblem of wealth against the school's faded peeling paint, had stopped. His presence was an anomaly, a disruption in the carefully orchestrated humiliation. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, piercing and unnervingly perceptive, found Kayla's. They held no pity, no condescension, only a profound, unsettling understanding. He too had known the sting of a teacher's scorn, the indelible brand of poverty, the cold burn of public shame. He moved then, not with the bluster of intervention, but with the quiet solemnity of a witness. He didn't speak to Pierce, didn't challenge the atrocity unfolding. Instead, he walked slowly to an empty desk near Kayla, the scuffed plastic protesting under his weight, and sat on its edge, a silent, unexpected sentinel. His stillness was more potent than any outcry. The clippers, having completed their primary task on the crown of her head, paused. Miss Pierce seemed momentarily distracted by the intruder, her smirk faltering for a microsecond, before reasserting itself tighter, now more defiant. The man's voice, when it came, was a low rumble, almost a whisper, yet it cut through the charged silence, reaching Kayla above the dying whine of the clippers. "I didn't come to save you." He said, his gaze locked on hers, a strange, almost painful intensity within them. "I came because you deserve to be seen." The school bell shrieked, then a harsh, dry, metallic cry that ricocheted down the hallway with the force of a physical blow. Its echoes seemed to amplify the desolation. The sunlight-streaked linoleum floor of the corridor, visible through the open door, looked like evenly spaced healing gashes on the ground. Classroom 7B nestled at the desolate end of the hall. Its grimy glass pane perpetually smudged, and its chalk dust-covered board, obscuring the harsh truths within, had become a crucible. A place where innocence was not lost, but forcibly, methodically stripped away. Kayla Brooks, occupant of the second-to-last desk, now felt the phantom itch, the ghost of her glossy black wig, which lay in a tangled, pathetic heap on the floor, like a discarded animal pelt. That wig, her precious, painstakingly maintained shield, had covered almost her entire forehead, hiding the patch of smooth, vulnerable skin. A glaring testament to Linda's Wales, the autoimmune disease that had claimed every strand of her natural hair when she was just 8. It was a secret fiercely guarded, a vulnerability never to be exposed. Until now. Until Miss Pierce. This quiet, unassuming 12-year-old girl never made a fuss. She navigated the treacherous currents of school life with the stealth of a hunted creature. No unnecessary talking, no spontaneous laughter, definitely no arguing. Each day was a meticulously planned exercise in invisibility. Her old faded beanie, a comfort from younger, slightly less harsh years, had been her public face in the corridors, only to be quickly swapped for the constricting, itchy wig in the dim, cracked mirror of the girls' restroom before class. The beanie was now banned by Miss Pierce's newly instated, rigorously enforced, no hats in class rule, a rule Kayla suspected was aimed squarely at her. Kayla's family wasn't anything special. Not in the eyes of the world, certainly not in the eyes of Margaret Pierce. Her dad Mike was a mechanic in a dilapidated garage on the outskirts of Rose Hill. His hands always stained a deep, ingrained black, with oil and grease, a permanent tattoo of his labor. His smiles were rare, but genuine, usually reserved for Kayla's small, infrequent triumphs. Her mum, Linda, worked as a waitress at the Greasy Spoon Diner near the bus station, a place that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Her shifts were brutal, starting at 5:30 in the morning when the first truckers rolled in and ending long after the sun had set when the clock finally mercifully struck set 9:01 p.m. They never attended parent-teacher conferences, not because they didn't care. They cared with a fierce, protective love that was the bedrock of Kayla's existence. But because time off was a luxury, they simply couldn't afford a stark contrast to the comfortable lives and crisp paychecks Miss Pierce undoubtedly enjoyed. The night before this particular horror, the Brooks kitchen had offered its usual meager bounty: 2 eggs, a shrinking half-loaf of stale bread, and the dregs of a milk carton. Linda, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, fried the eggs with the last smear of oil from the bottle. Her eyes glued to the tiny, unforgiving screen of her aging smartphone, where the banking app displayed their current balance, $3.17. A familiar dread, cold and heavy, settled in Kayla's stomach. "I'll ask for a half-day off tomorrow morning." Linda had said, her voice raspy, defeated. "To take you to get your wig re-glued. The old glue is coming loose again, isn't it, love?" She ran a gentle hand over Kayla's wig, her touch of fleeting comfort. "It's okay, Mom." Kayla had replied, already a seasoned veteran in the art of stoic reassurance. "I can do it myself. I watched a video. We can save the money." It was her standard refrain, a mantra against the encroaching tide of their poverty. "It's not about the money, Kayla." Linda had argued, a flash of her old spirit in her tired eyes. But then she'd fallen silent because it was always invariably about the money. The weight of that unspoken truth hung between them heavier than the scent of frying eggs. Kayla had taken the half-loaf of bread, but didn't take a bite. Instead, she'd carefully wrapped it in a piece of plastic wrap, placed it in a plastic container, and quietly slipped it into her backpack. Tomorrow's lunch. At school, she often lied, a small, sad fabrication, claiming she'd already eaten or wasn't hungry anything. to avoid the humiliation of opening her meager lunchbox in front of her friends, whose own lunches were often vibrant and plentiful. Her dad still wasn't home. The evening shift at Henderson's garage often stretched until midnight, sometimes later if there was a rush job. Kayla knew the acrid metallic smell of motor oil had long ago become ingrained in her dad's clothes, his skin, his very essence. The kind of tenacious smell no amount of cheap soap or Linda's treasured rose-scented perfume could ever truly cover. That night, Kayla lay with her back pressed against the cold, damp wall of her small bedroom, her eyes wide open in the oppressive darkness. On the peeling paint of the ceiling, a long, jagged crack stretched out like a dry, desolate riverbed, a road map of their crumbling reality. She could hear her mother coughing softly in the next room, a persistent wheezing sound that spoke of exhaustion and untreated ailments. She could hear her father tossing and turning on the lumpy sofa in the living room, and the only bed he could still use comfortably after his back surgery a few years prior. The surgery had cost them everything, and their meager savings wiped out a mountain of debt accrued. No one complained. No one ever uttered the word difficult or struggle. But Kayla understood. Poverty was a silent, insidious beast, something that didn't need to be named to exert its crushing, suffocating presence. This morning's math class had begun like any other, with the low hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of chalk dust and anxiety. Then Miss Pierce's voice, as cold and sharp as shards of ice falling onto a steel table, had snapped Kayla back to the grim present. Kayla Brooks. All eyes in the class, 30 pairs of them, had turned to her, a collective, unwelcome spotlight. She looked up slowly, a defensive reflex honed over months of similar targeted interrogations. "You intend to hand in your math homework, I presume." Miss Pierce had glided down the aisle between the rows of desks, her footsteps sharp, precise, like a metronome marking time for an impending execution. In her hand was Kayla's homework, a series of equations painstakingly rendered, not just in numbers, but illustrated with tiny, intricate drawings. Birds with numerical wings, rabbits, whose ears formed algebraic symbols, a whole tangled, beautiful universe contained within the margins of the cheap-lined paper. Rendered, I see, in crayon. The word was drawn out laden with contempt. "No, ma'am, Kayla began, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on a crack in her desktop. "I just drew in the margins. The answers are in pen." "In the margins," Miss Pierce repeated, her voice dripping with scorn. "Margins are for notes, Miss Brooks, not for juvenile defacement. Children like you?" Her eyes swept dismissively over Kayla's patched uniform. "Should be profoundly grateful to simply be sitting in this classroom benefiting from a public education instead of wasting valuable time and resources on such frivolous scribbles and that, quite frankly, ridiculous synthetic hair." Her eyes had flicked pointedly to Kayla's wig. The class fell into a sudden, suffocating silence. A few nervous giggles rippled from the back row, quickly stifled. Most didn't dare. Emily, sitting next to her, edged closer, her expression a mixture of anger and helplessness, about to say something, anything. But Kayla gave a barely perceptible shake of her head. "No need. Don't make it worse." Miss Pierce had folded the notebook shut with a decisive snap and thrown it onto Kayla's desk. The harsh sound rang out with an unnerving clarity in the quiet room. "Redo it by tomorrow. In pen. No colors. No embellishments. And remember, Miss Brooks, this is a mathematics class, not a preliminary art session for a fairy tale illustration competition." No one spoke, not even when Miss Pierce turned and walked back to the teacher's desk at the front of the room, her stride as firm and unyielding as someone utterly accustomed to crushing any form of resistance, however small. Class eventually ended. The children rushed out as if freed from a cage, their chatter a sudden, almost desperate burst of noise. But Kayla remained seated, a small, solitary figure, in the suddenly empty classroom. Outside, it had started to rain lightly, a mournful, weeping drizzle. The raindrops tapped insistently on the window pane like someone knocking patiently but hopelessly. She was left alone in the classroom, her desk feeling like a small exposed trench in an invisible, unending battle. She opened her worn pencil case, took out a red crayon, a forbidden color, then stopped. Her hand froze in midair, the crayon suspended. Her eyes stared at the blank accusing space on the page before her. The numbers, the birds, the shadows, they all seemed to mock her. The classroom door creaked open again. Kayla tensed. "Still here, Miss Brooks?" It wasn't a question. Miss Pierce stood framed in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression one of smug disapproval. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned Kayla, lingering with pointed distaste on the glossy black wig. "Next time," she said, her voice soft, almost confidential, yet laced with an unmistakable menace. "Remember to glue that thing on tight. If it happens to fall off during my class." She let the sentence hang, a smirk playing on her thin lips, half mocking, half threatening. "Well, no one wants to see the messy truth beneath, do they? It can be so unsettling for the other children." Kayla didn't answer. She just bowed her head lower, the shame a hot, suffocating blanket. Her hand gripped the red crayon so tightly her knuckles were white. "Just like your mother." Miss Pierce continued, her voice taking on a tone of faux sympathy that was more cutting than overt cruelty. "Always putting on airs. Those waitresses, they all like to pretend to be so prim and proper, so fancy in their little uniforms. Then they go home and count their pennies to eat instant noodles. Heredity is a fascinating thing, Miss Brooks, so remarkably easy to spot. 1 second, 2 seconds." Miss Pierce waited, visibly anticipating a reaction. Tears, a retort, anything to confirm her power. But Kayla remained silent, still a statue of stoic suffering. Miss Pierce shrugged, a dismissive theatrical gesture. "Suit yourself." She left her high heels clicking coldly, imperiously on the polished linoleum floor, the sound fading into the anemic hum of the school. Kayla remained there motionless for a long time. The red crayon lay between her fingers, an inert splash of defiant color in a world of gray. She wasn't drawing anything, just staring at the blank paper, a landscape of her own internal desolation. On her way home, she passed the town square where workers were stringing up lights and unfurling faded banners for the upcoming Rose Hill Founders' Day picnic, a celebration of the town's pioneering families that always felt miles away from her own reality. The grand, dilapidated old Henderson textile mill, silent for decades, loomed in the distance, a skeletal reminder of past prosperity that had bypassed so many. A moment later, Emily's head peeked around the door again, her expression anxious. "Kayla, are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice hesitant. Kayla nodded, a small jerky movement, even though she was clearly profoundly not okay. She's awful," Emily whispered, stepping into the room, her own distress evident. I'll talk to my mom. My mom knows Principal Myers. She can..." "Don't." Kayla said, her voice flat, devoid of inflection, her eyes still fixed on the notebook as if it held some terrible magnetic power. "Please, Emily, just don't. But you can't just let her treat you like this. It's not right." "I'm fine." The words came out like a cage, slamming shut, each syllable a bar, decisively, irrevocably, not letting anyone in. Emily hesitated, her face a mask of conflict and frustration, and then she backed away slowly. The door closed behind her with a soft, resigned click. Kayla remained, her small shoulders unmoving, though they felt burdened by an invisible, crushing weight. The wind outside the window blew a little harder, carrying the dry, mournful rustling of fallen leaves. In her hand, the red crayon squeezed with an unconscious, desperate force, snapped in two. The broken piece fell silently to the ground, rolling in a small, aimless circle before coming to rest. And Kayla's eyes, at the only part of her she couldn't entirely hide, were still staring at the empty space on the page, as if waiting with a hopeless tenacity for something to appear. Something undefined, something beyond words, but certainly desperately not silence. She sat motionless, long after the last bell, her hands clutching the broken halves of the colored pencil, her eyes, the one feature that yearned to disappear, yet simultaneously craved to be truly seen, fixed on an invisible horizon. The events of that afternoon, the clippers, the man's quiet presence, were now seared into her memory. The public shaving had been the culmination, but the prelude had been weeks, months of insidious, soul-crushing remarks, always about her family's poverty, always delivered with Pierce's signature blend of saccharine condescension and razor-sharp contempt. There was the time Pierce had accidentally spilled coffee on Kayla's meticulously repaired textbook, remarking, "Ikidits, oh dear, some things just can't be salvaged, can they?" Or the day she'd announced a class field trip to the City Museum, adding with a pointed look at Kayla, "Financial assistance forms are available for those who qualify." Though one wonders if some families shouldn't prioritize necessities. Each incident was a small, deliberate cut, slowly bleeding Kayla of her confidence. Now, in the aftermath of the shaving, the raw, exposed skin of her scalp throbbed a physical manifestation of her shredded dignity. The man, Ethan Cole, she would later learn his name, had left shortly after the bell, giving her a small, almost imperceptible nod. His presence had been strange, an unexpected anchor in the storm of her humiliation. The nurse's office, just minutes before the man's arrival at classroom 7B, had been the true stage for this premeditated cruelty. Make sincere, Adams Monroe. The school nurse, a woman whose weary kindness usually offered a small balm to scraped knees and fevers, had seemed genuinely distressed, yet utterly cowed by Pierce's domineering presence. "Margaret, are you absolutely certain about this?" Miss Adams Monroe had whispered, her voice laced with genuine alarm, her eyes darting nervously towards Kayla, who stood small and trembling by the examination bed. "Mrs. Brooks submitted medical documentation at the beginning of the year. Alopecia areata, I recall. It's a legitimate condition. I even tried to subtly speak to Mrs. Brooks last month, hinting that Miss Pierce was particularly inflexible regarding the new dress code. Documents, my dear Agnes, can be acquired or exaggerated." Miss Pierce had countered, her voice syrupy sweet, yet laced with an unmistakable undercurrent of steel. She picked up a sterile pack of wipes from the counter, dabbing at an imaginary speck on her perfectly manicured nails. Besides, the school policy is quite clear regarding no ostentatious or distracting headwear. And that confection, she gestured dismissively towards Kayla's wig, was drawing far too much undue attention. It's a distraction to the other students, plain and simple. For the sake of consistency, we must enforce the rules uniformly. Surely you see the pedagogical imperative here. Principal Myers trusts my judgment explicitly in maintaining classroom standards. You wouldn't want to be the one seen as obstructing school policy, would you, Agnes? Ms. Adams Monroe wrung her hands, her usually calm face etched with profound unease. But Margaret, to shave her hair. Here in school, can't we just call her mother? Send her home, perhaps? And reward her blatant defiance with an excused absence? Absolutely not. Pierce stated, her voice hardening. A quick, discreet trim, that's all that's required, to ensure it's not being worn as some sort of defiant fashion statement. She had picked up the clippers from the sterilized tray herself, her grip firm, her expression one of unwavering resolve. Frankly, Agnes, it's for her own good. To teach her that rules apply to everyone equally regardless of unfortunate circumstance. The buzz of the clippers had started then, a cruel, invasive sound. Kayla's whispered, "No, please don't," had been swallowed by its menacing hum, and Pierce's cold, implacable will. Ethan Cole, at that precise moment, had been enduring a tour of the school's chronically underfunded and dilapidated library, with Principal Ronald Myers. Myers, a portly man, with a forced, ingratiating smile and eyes that never quite met yours, was in the midst of an enthusiastic, if somewhat desperate fundraising pitch. And with adequate, shall we say, visionary funding, Mr. Cole, this entire wing could be transformed. We envision the Ethan Cole Center for Literacy and Technological Advancement. Ethan, whose own childhood library had been a single dog-eared shelf in a crowded orphanage, had barely been listening. His attention, preternaturally sharp, had snagged on a scene glimpsed through the slightly ajar door of the nurse's office across the hall. "What's happening in there, Myers?" He'd interrupted, his voice quiet, but carrying an edge that made the principal visibly flinch. "Ah, that Mr. Cole," Myers had stammered, a sheen of sweat suddenly appearing on his upper lip. "Just a minor, disciplinary matter. A student you see not quite adhering to the school's grooming standards. Miss Pierce is firm but exceptionally fair. She has an excellent, unblemished record for maintaining high standards of decorum in her classroom." But Ethan had seen it all in that brief, damning glimpse, the glint of the clippers, Kayla's stricken, terrified face, the nurse's anguished helplessness, and Miss Pierce's cool, almost triumphant expression. The ghosts of his own past. The scornful eyes of Miss Lavender, the sting of scissors against his own scalp, the searing public humiliation, had surged back with an almost physical force. He'd given Principal Myers a curt, dismissive nod, a silent storm gathering in his eyes, and had made his way uninvited purposefully to witness the final act of degradation in classroom 7B. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was no minor infraction. This was a calculated act of cruelty, a public execution of a child's spirit. The news of the incident, savagely amplified by Emily Johnson's trembling, secretly recorded 28-second video, became a torrent of digital fury. Emily, pale and shaken, had shown it to her older sister Nina, a fiery third-year law student and intern at a child rights organization. "Nina, I don't know what to do," Emily had whispered, tears in her eyes. "Miss Pierce, she's terrifying. Mom's always said to keep our heads down, not to cause trouble with teachers here. She's been so stressed lately, telling me not to rock the boat." Nina's jaw tightened as she watched the footage, her initial shock turning to cold fury. "Rock the boat, Em. They just capsized Kayla's entire world. Your mom, she means well. But sometimes keeping your head down means letting monsters win. This isn't causing trouble. This is demanding justice." Within hours, Nina, with Emily's reluctant but brave consent, had posted the video online with a furious caption, "This is happening in an American public school. Oscars stand with Kayla." 40,000 shares morphed into millions overnight. Comments poured in a global chorus of outrage and disbelief. "This isn't discipline. It's state-sanctioned child abuse. That teacher needs to be fired, prosecuted, and never allowed near children again, not suspended for a single day. My heart breaks for that poor girl. What kind of monster does this?" The school's official response, issued late the next day after an emergency board meeting, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic deflection and institutional gaslighting. An internal review of the incident is underway. The teacher involved has been temporarily suspended for 1 day pending the outcome of this review. To protect the privacy of all parties involved, no further comment will be made at this time. One day? Linda's voice, when she read the statement on her cracked phone screen, broke on a sob. They value my daughter's pain, her dignity, her very soul, at one day. She threw the phone onto the threadbare sofa as if it were contaminated. Mike, his face a mask of impotent fury, punched the rickety kitchen table. The sound a dull, painful thud in the small, oppressive space. The cheap glass of water sitting there toppled, spilling its contents in a small, violent wave that mirrored the turmoil in their hearts. "Isn't there anything we can do?" He choked out, his voice raw with a grief he couldn't articulate. "Who are we, Mike?" Linda wept, her shoulders shaking. "We're just a waitress and a mechanic. Who listens to people like us in this town, who fights for the voiceless?" That night, after refusing dinner and locking herself in her room, Kayla did not weep. Tears felt too inadequate, too futile. Instead, she pulled out a forgotten piece of white chalk, a remnant from a happier, simpler time. She walked to the wall, where the long, dark crack snaked like a dried riverbed, and she began to draw. Not a flower, not a kitten, not the swirling galaxies she usually sketched. She drew a single stark, headless shadow. Its form was elongated, androgynous, its identity erased, its hands hanging limply at its sides. It stood silently, yet seemed to be walking relentlessly into an unknown, unseeable void. Across town, in his sprawling, silent mansion, a monument to his hard-won success, Ethan Cole watched Emily's harrowing 28-second clip for the 10th, perhaps 20th time. The girl's hunched shoulders, Pierce's cold, clinical movements, the glint of steel, the chilling finality of it all. Miss Lavender's shrill, contemptuous voice echoed across the gulf of 40 long years. "Ethan Cole, your hair is unkempt again. You look like a street urchin. Students here must be neat, clean, and presentable." Then the cold, unwelcome snip of the large office scissors, the tufts of his own dark hair falling like dead leaves onto his scarred wooden desk. The crushing weight of the entire class's gaze. The subsequent expulsion for failing to meet acceptable standards of hygiene and appearance. The shame had been a living, breathing entity, then a parasitic twin he'd carried for years. He hadn't just been lucky to survive that. He'd clawed his way out, fueled by a burning, incandescent rage and a solemn private vow, if he ever possessed the power, the influence, the means no other child would ever have to endure that cold, public stripping of self, that brutal negation of their worth, if he could prevent it. He found Principal Myers's private number in his contacts. A single phone call, a few carefully chosen words. He could destroy careers, dismantle reputations, unleash a firestorm that would consume Rose Hill School. But he paused. He looked again at Kayla's face in the video just for a fraction of a second before she bowed her head completely. In her eyes, he saw not just terror, but a flicker of something else, something he recognized, a nascent, defiant spark buried deep beneath layers of pain. "That girl is me." He thought the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. 40 years apart, different circumstances, but the same wound. He closed his phone. She doesn't need a knight in shining armor to save her. She needs an ally, someone to believe that her fight is worth fighting, someone to hand her the tools to forge her own weapons. The next morning, Ethan's black Range Rover, usually driven by a discreet chauffeur, pulled up to the curb outside the Brooks' modest, slightly run-down house. Ethan himself was behind the wheel. He carried a small, plainly wrapped gift box. No entourage, no fanfare. He knocked his knuckles, rapping against the peeling paint of the front door. Mike Brooks opened it, his face a study in wary, sleep-deprived skepticism. His t-shirt was stained with fresh motor oil. Linda appeared behind him, her eyes red-rimmed, her expression as taut as a drawn bowstring braced for more bad news, more hardship. Mr. and Mrs. Brooks. Ethan began, his voice calm, respectful. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm not a reporter or from the school district. I'm a friend. I saw what happened to Kayla. I want to help. He looked from Mike's guarded face to Linda's exhausted, fearful one, his gaze direct, unwavering. I was that child once. He added softly, the admission hanging in the cool morning air. Linda searched his eyes, a flicker of desperate, fragile hope dawning in hers. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod towards the back of the house. Her room is the last one down the hall, but she hasn't spoken a word to anyone since yesterday. Not eating, not looking at anyone. I understand, Ethan replied, his voice gentle. Sometimes words are the hardest things to find. Kayla was sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, her newly bare head looking incredibly small and vulnerable. She was hugging a faded, threadbare pillow to her chest as if it were a life raft. The headless chalk figure loomed like a silent sentinel on the wall beside her bed. She looked up when Ethan entered, her eyes wide, wary, but not panicked. He was a stranger, but his face was the one she remembered from the classroom, the one who had seen. Ethan didn't sit on the bed, didn't invade her small, fragile space. He pulled up the room's single wobbly plastic chair and sat placing the gift box, a set of high-quality colored pencils, vibrant and new, on the small, cluttered nightstand. He didn't speak immediately. He just sat sharing the silence, a rare gift. They cut my hair too, he said finally, his voice a low murmur, as if sharing a profound secret. Right in the middle of class. Because my clothes were old. Because we were poor. Kayla blinked, a tiny flicker of reaction in her otherwise still face. For the first time since the ordeal began, an adult wasn't asking her the dreaded, impossible question. Are you okay? This man was saying simply, profoundly, I understand. It took me many, many years to understand. He continued, his gaze distant, reflective, that it wasn't my shame to carry. It was theirs. The shame belonged to those who wielded their power like a weapon, who found satisfaction in a child's humiliation. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a persistent, insistent vibration. He glanced at it. Nina Johnson's original post, the one with Emily's video, had ignited a national firestorm. It had unearthed a veritable cesspool of similar stories. Former students of Margaret Pierce from years past were now coming forward, emboldened by Kayla's horrific public ordeal. Stories of relentless bullying, casual cruelty, discriminatory remarks about race-class appearance. She called my naturally curly hair a crow's nest and made me sit at the back of the class. She told my friend, whose parents were immigrants, that he'd never amount to anything more than a dishwasher because he mispronounced the word equation. The hashtag Dasher Stand with Kayla was trending globally. Underneath it, Ostrich Pierce the Silence and Myers Must Go were gaining traction. Ethan showed Kayla his phone, the endless scroll of messages, of shared pain, of burgeoning support. See, he said softly, you are not alone. Your silence has spoken volumes, and now others are finding their voices too. As he got up to leave, his gaze fell again on the headless chalk drawing. Maybe you don't need saving, Kayla, he said, his voice thoughtful. Maybe what you really need are the right tools to redraw yourself, to reclaim your own image. The atmosphere at Rose Hill School the following Monday was a palpable miasma of nervous whispers, furtive glances, and barely concealed panic. Ethan Cole, dressed not in a power suit, but in a simple gray cashmere sweater and dark trousers, arrived unannounced. He bypassed the chaotic front office and went straight to Principal Ronald Myers' office. Mr. Cole? Myers exclaimed, jumping up from his leather chair, his face a mask of forced bonhomie that couldn't quite conceal the terror in his shifty eyes. So glad you could make the time to come in. This unfortunate, regrettable incident with Miss Brooks. Unfortunate or systemic Principal Myers. Ethan's voice was quiet, deceptively mild, but it sliced through Myers' bluster like a scalpel. Miss Pierce's one-day suspension is not just an insult to Kayla Brooks and her family. It's an indictment of this institution's priorities. What school rules, what pedagogical philosophy could possibly justify such a barbaric act of cruelty? We adhere to all national and state educational standards, Mr. Cole, of course. Myers stammered, dabbing at his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. With certain necessary local adaptations to maintain an orderly learning environment for all our students. And what happens, Principal? Ethan pressed his eyes like chips of ice. If the rules themselves are flawed, or if those entrusted to enforce them are morally bankrupt? What if your orderly learning environment is built upon a foundation of fear and selective oppression? He stood up, his quiet presence filling the opulent office with an undeniable, unyielding authority. I am not here today to dictate educational policy to you, Myers. I am here because a child was psychologically brutalized under your watch, and your entire system appears to be culpably designed to protect the perpetrator, not the victim. As Ethan walked out, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent corridor, he passed a classroom where another teacher's voice, sharp and laced with familiar irritation, drifted out. It was Margaret Pierce. She was back. Her one-day suspension evidently concluded. Thomas, are you quite finished admiring your artistic rendition of the Pythagorean theorem? Drawing your triangles in fluorescent pink marker will not, I assure you, make your answer any more correct. This is a mathematics class, not an audition for Barbie's Dreamhouse design team. And that uniform shirt, Thomas, it's gray. The regulation color is white. Can't your mother afford a simple white shirt, or is this some new form of adolescent rebellion I'm not yet privy to? Ethan stopped. He walked into the classroom. A collective gasp. Instant, unnerving silence. Miss Pierce spun around a piece of chalk clutched in her hand, her face paling slightly when she saw him. Mr. Cole, I wasn't aware you were still on the premises. Miss Pierce, Ethan said, his voice dangerously calm. You're back in the classroom already. I completed the required internal review procedures this morning, Mr. Cole, she replied, regaining a sliver of her composure, though her eyes darted nervously. I am merely reminding my students about the importance of academic rigor and adherence to school standards. Ethan's gaze shifted to the boy Thomas, who was cowering in his seat, his face flaming red, his knuckles white as he gripped a pink marker. He then looked directly at Pierce, his eyes burning with a cold, controlled fury. What exactly did you say to Kayla Brooks in the nurse's office, Miss Pierce, before you took those clippers to her head? I simply reiterated the school's clear policy on headwear, she faltered. She was in violation. I was ensuring compliance. He gulped. Ethan then turned not just to Thomas, but to the entire class, his voice resonating with a quiet power that commanded their full attention. If anyone in this room, anyone in this school, has ever been made to feel less than insignificant or ashamed because of how you look, because of your family's circumstances, because of the clothes you wear or the way you speak, please know this. It is never your fault. And the silence, or worse, the complicity of adults in positions of power does not and never will make their cruelty, their prejudice, or their abuse right. He walked out, leaving Margaret Pierce standing, frozen chalk dust settling around her like a shroud, and an entire classroom of students suddenly startlingly awake. Later that week, after being briefly reinstated, Pierce saw Kayla walking alone near the public library. Her car slid to a halt. "Well, well, Kayla Brooks," Pierce sneered through the open window, her voice dripping malice. "Enjoying your newfound notoriety. You think that rich man will save you. People like him get bored easily. And people like you, well, you always end up back where you belong. Drop this foolishness. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. It'll be easier for everyone, especially your struggling parents." Kayla met her gaze pale but unflinching, clutching her sketchbook like a shield, and walked away without a word, Pierce's venomous laughter echoing behind her. Ethan immediately contacted Grace Miller, a renowned, formidable civil rights lawyer whose reputation for dismantling injustice was legendary. Her office, a minimalist space filled with books and the quiet hum of focused energy, overlooked the bustling city. Grace, a woman in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense and deception, listened to Ethan's account and watched the 28-second video of Kayla's ordeal 3 times in complete silence. When it finished for the 3rd time, she leaned back in her chair, her expression a mixture of cold fury and steely resolve. 12 years old. She said, her voice quiet but resonating with controlled anger. No parental consent, a known medical condition deliberately ignored. And they have the audacity to call this rule enforcement. She looked at Ethan. "You came to the right place, Mr. Cole. We don't deal in pity here. We deal in justice. And justice for Kayla Brooks is precisely what we are going to get." The decision to sue was made, but the path was immediately fraught with peril. One morning, Mike Brooks arrived at his garage to find the tires of 2 customer cars slashed and a crude message spray-painted on the door: "Back off. Accidents happen." That night, anonymous texts began appearing on Linda's phone, photos of Kayla walking home from school of their house at night, captioned, "We're watching. Think about your daughter." Fear, cold and palpable, gripped the family. Linda begged Mike, "Maybe we should stop. What if they hurt Kayla?" Mike, his face grim, held her tight. "If we stop, they win. They'll do this to someone else's child." But Kayla, overhearing, felt a fresh wave of terror. She was the cause of this danger. Within days, Grace Miller and her team launched a full-scale investigation that was both swift and terrifyingly thorough. Evidence began to mount with alarming speed. Kayla's official medical diagnosis and confirmation of alopecia, along with a letter from her pediatrician explicitly requesting accommodation for her wig. Documents Linda Brooks had painstakingly submitted in person at the beginning of the school year were conspicuously missing from the school's official student records. Instead, there was only a vague, undated note initialed by Myers stating, "Student KB, headwear query. Refer to MP for standard procedure." Answer. Grace unearthed a damning series of past parental complaints filed against Margaret Pierce spanning several years, alleging everything from verbal abuse and targeted bullying to discriminatory grading practices and fostering a hostile classroom environment. None of these complaints had ever been formally investigated or responded to by Principal Myers or the school board. They had simply vanished. Then Grace's intern, a tech-savvy young woman, managed to recover a partially deleted email chain from the school's server, sent between several senior teachers and Principal Myers around the time of the "no hats in class" rule implementation. The subject line was chillingly casual. "Re the wig girl issue." One email from Myers to Pierce read, "Margaret, appreciate you taking the lead on this. Just let Pierce handle it as discussed. She has her effective methods for dealing with these kinds of special attention-seeking games. Keep me looped, but keep it clean." This isn't just an isolated incident of a rogue teacher, Ethan. Grace said, her voice grim, placing the printed email on her desk. This is a clear, demonstrable pattern of systemic abuse, condoned, enabled, and actively covered up from the very top of this school's administration. The veins on Ethan's clenched fist stood out in stark relief against his skin. His jaw was tight. This isn't just about one mistake. This is a corrupt system that knows it's wrong, that has been proven wrong time and again, and still allows the cruelty to continue unchecked. While reviewing PTA financial records as part of due diligence on school governance, Grace noticed discrepancies linked to a prominent board member's pet projects and Emily's mother, Mrs. Johnson, who volunteered as PTA treasurer. Emily had mentioned her mother being increasingly stressed, uncharacteristically short-tempered, and advising Nina to be careful who you make enemies of in this town. It can have long-term consequences. Grace filed it away as an anomaly. The crucial turning point, the bombshell that would blow the case wide open, came from an unexpected source. Adam Lewis, a young, visibly nervous IT technician from Rose Hill School, proactively emailed Ethan requesting an urgent confidential meeting. They met in a small, deserted coffee shop near the train station, far from the prying eyes of the Rose Hill community. Adam, clutching a worn backpack to his chest, his hand trembling as he stirred his untouched coffee, began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Cole, I saw the video of Kayla, the one Emily Johnson took. It was horrific. But there's more." He took a deep breath, his moral compass overriding his fear. "The nurse's office. It has a security camera. It automatically records and saves footage to the school's main server. That camera, it recorded everything that happened to Kayla in there, before, during, and after." Ethan leaned forward, his eyes narrowed, his expression intense. "And this footage?" Adam swallowed hard, his gaze darting nervously around the empty cafe. 3 hours after the incident, I received a direct verbal order from Principal Ronald Myers himself. He called me into his office. He told me to delete that specific segment of the recording immediately. "What reason did he give?" Ethan asked, his voice low, dangerous. He said to avoid any unnecessary media scrutiny, to prevent trouble and protect the school's reputation. He told me to just say the camera had been malfunctioning that day, if anyone asked. He said, "No one will ever check. Just make it disappear, Lewis." "And did you?" Grace, who had joined the meeting at Ethan's discreet signal, asked quietly from the booth behind them. Adam looked from Ethan to Grace, his face pale but resolute. Not completely." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small external hard drive. I couldn't just delete it. It felt wrong. So I made a full, unedited copy first, before I followed his order and deleted the master file from the server. I told myself it was for my own protection in case something like this came up later. But mostly, he looked down at his hands. I needed to be able to sleep at night. Grace connected the hard drive to her laptop. The footage captured from a high-angle camera in the corner of the nurse's office was crystal clear, the audio sharp and undeniable. It showed Kayla's initial entry, her visible fear. It showed Nurse Adams Monroe's clear reluctance, her hushed, urgent protests to Miss Pierce. It showed Pierce's dismissive, manipulative responses, her casual cruelty as she prepared the clippers. It showed the horrifying moments of the actual shaving, Kayla's silent, trembling endurance. And then, crucially, it showed what happened after Kayla had been led away, presumably, back to class. Miss Pierce returned to the nurse's office alone, a smug, satisfied expression on her face. The camera clearly recorded her conversation with a distressed Miss Adams Monroe. "See, Agnes." Pierce had said, her voice dripping with condescension. "All handled, efficiently. No lasting fuss. Principal Myers will be exceedingly pleased I dealt with this little wig situation." so discreetly and effectively. He truly appreciates teachers who aren't afraid to take decisive action to maintain classroom discipline and school standards. He owes me a few favors after all. This just adds to the tally. She'd then picked up her handbag, given a dismissive little wave, and breezed out. Grace Miller slowly closed her laptop, her face grim. "Irrefutable," she breathed. "This footage corroborates everything. It proves Pierce's malicious intent, the nurse's coerced compliance, and most damningly, Principal Myers' active complicity in both the act and the subsequent cover-up. Pierce wasn't just a rogue teacher on a power trip. She was his designated enforcer, a protected asset, confident in his backing. This isn't just about Kayla, is it? This is about a deeply embedded culture of abuse and impunity. This was the twist Ethan had long suspected, but couldn't definitively prove. Myers wasn't merely a weak, incompetent administrator. He was an active, knowing participant in a corrupt system, one who had likely shielded Pierce from repercussions for years. The lawsuit, when it was filed, was a legal firestorm. It named Margaret Pierce, Principal Ronald Myers, and the entire Lincoln County School Board as defendants. Arrest warrants were swiftly issued for Pierce and Myers based on the strength of the video evidence and Adam Lewis's courageous testimony. Margaret Pierce, when apprehended at her home, put on a display of outraged innocence, her voice dripping with contempt, even as the handcuffs clicked shut. "This is an outrage, a ridiculous, slanderous farce. She's a pathetic, attention-seeking little brat from a deadbeat family. You think this little drama scares me? I will be exonerated." Principal Myers, in contrast, seemed to visibly shrink when the police arrived at his office, his bluster dissolving into a puddle of stammering incoherence. The trial of Margaret Pierce and Ronald Myers became a national media circus. Courtroom number 3 at the Fulton County Courthouse was packed to capacity every single day. Outside, a growing number of Rose Hill students, past and present, organized silent vigils holding signs, "We believe Kayla." No more pierced silence. Kayla Brooks, her hair now a soft, short fuzz that stubbornly refused to be hidden, attended every session sitting quietly between her parents. In her hands, she clutched not a teddy bear, but her ever-present sketchbook, its pages filled with the silent, powerful testimony of her trauma and her resilience. Emily Johnson and her sister Nina were there too. A steadfast, unwavering presence in the front row, a quiet symbol of solidarity and the power of youthful courage. Ethan Cole sat further back, a discreet observer, his role as catalyst now complete. Grace Miller, in her opening statement, was devastatingly eloquent. This is not a case about a simple breach of school rules. She declared, her voice resonating with conviction. This is a case about the systematic abuse of power, about the deliberate, malicious infliction of emotional distress upon a vulnerable child, and about a culture of corruption and cover-up that allowed such atrocities to flourish unchecked for far too long. Nurse Adams Monroe testified, her voice trembling but clear, her account corroborated in every horrifying detail by Adam Lewis's damning video footage. She recounted Pierce's manipulative coercion, her chilling boasts about Principal Myers' protection, and her own profound fear of reprisal had she refused to comply. Miss Pierce often spoke of being untouchable, Ms. Adams Monroe admitted. She said Principal Myers valued her loyalty and her ability to handle difficult students decisively. I was terrified of losing my job if I defied her. My husband has been ill. We need my insurance. But my silence has haunted me every single day. Adam Lewis, despite facing intense pressure and veiled threats from figures connected to the school board, bravely took the stand, authenticating the video footage and recounting Principal Myers' explicit order to delete it. His quiet courage was a stark contrast to the defendant's arrogance. Grace Miller then presented a series of former students of Margaret Pierce, now adults. each with their own harrowing story of humiliation, discrimination, and psychological abuse. Their combined testimony painted a chilling, undeniable portrait of a serial predator operating with impunity under the protective umbrella of a complicit administration. Then came Pierce's defense. Her lawyer, smooth and aggressive, attempted to discredit Kayla by calling a surprise witness Mrs. Johnson, Emily's mother. The courtroom gasped. Emily looked utterly betrayed. Mrs. Johnson, pale and visibly shaking reluctantly, testified that Kayla's original school entry forms indicated a history of social adjustment difficulties and seeking undue attention after her hair loss. Producing a poorly photocopied altered document as proof. It was a calculated, vicious blow aimed directly at Kayla's credibility. During cross-examination, Grace Miller, sensing coercion, gently but relentlessly probed. Mrs. Johnson, you serve as PTA treasurer. Is it true that certain PTA funds, overseen by a board member with close ties to Mr. Myers, were recently diverted to projects that have faced scrutiny for irregularities, and that your husband's small construction company relies heavily on school district contracts? Mrs. Johnson broke down sobbing. Myers, he threatened me. He said if I didn't help them understand Kayla better, they'd find ways to ruin my husband, to look into discrepancies he implied I was responsible for. He said he just needed some old files recontextualized. I didn't want to. Oh God, Emily, I'm so sorry. The courtroom erupted. Myers' lawyer tried to object, but the damage was done. The twist was revealed not as a simple betrayal, but as another layer of Myers's corrupt coercion and Pierce's willing complicity in using it. The evidence was exposed as a desperate, fraudulent fabrication, further damning the defendants. Emily ran to her mother, not in anger, but in understanding and shared distress. Margaret Pierce, when she took the stand in her own defense, was a study in defiant, unrepentant narcissism. She portrayed herself as the victim, a dedicated teacher, railroaded by a vindictive child, a manipulative lawyer, and a sensationalist media. Her performance was chilling, but ultimately unconvincing. The jury saw through her carefully constructed facade. When it was Kayla's turn to testify, a profound hush fell over the courtroom. She walked to the witness stand, small but resolute, her sketchbook held tightly against her chest. Her voice, when she began to speak, was soft, almost a whisper, but it filled the vast courtroom with an undeniable, heartbreaking clarity. They said I violated the rules. She began, her gaze fixed not on Pierce, but on the sympathetic face of the judge. But no one ever asked me if I was scared. No one asked me if I was hurt. She paused, taking a small, shaky breath. I didn't cry then, not in front of them. Because if I cried, I was afraid I would scream. And if I screamed, they would say I was out of control, hysterical, just like she always said girls like me were. So I just stayed quiet. A single tear escaped and traced a slow path down her cheek, but her voice, when she continued, did not weaken. On the contrary, it gained a quiet, steely strength, as if tempered by the very fire of her suffering. My hair, it fell out because I was sick. My mom took me to so many doctors. The wig was so I could try to feel normal, so people wouldn't stare or whisper. I wasn't faking anything. Silence and trying to be invisible, those were the only things I'd ever done to try not to bother anyone, to not be a burden. Grace Miller approached the witness stand, her expression gentle, compassionate. Kayla, she said softly, if you could say one thing, just one thing to Miss Pierce right now from this stand, what would it be? The entire courtroom held its breath. Kayla slowly turned her head. She looked directly, unflinchingly, at Margaret Pierce, the woman who had tried to break her, the woman who sat stony-faced at the defendant's table, her eyes still blazing with a cold, unyielding contempt. Kayla held Pierce's gaze for a long, silent moment. Then she spoke each word, precise, deliberate, imbued with a wisdom far beyond her 12 years. "You didn't steal my voice, Miss Pierce." Kayla said, her voice clear, unwavering, resonant. "I was just keeping it safe. I was just waiting for the right moment to use it." Below in the public gallery, Emily Johnson sobbed openly, unashamedly, her arm around her now weeping mother. Linda Brooks clutched Mike's hand so tightly, her knuckles were white tears streaming down her own face. Ethan Cole, slowly, almost imperceptibly, nodded, a profound respect dawning in his eyes. As he adjusted his glasses, a subtle movement to hide the moisture gathering there. Grace Miller turned to the judge, her own voice thick with emotion. "Your Honor," she said, "the truth in its purest, most courageous form has now spoken." The jury's verdict, when it came after 2 long days of deliberation, was unanimous and damning. Margaret Pierce was found guilty on multiple felony counts, including aggravated assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress on a minor, and abuse of power. Ronald Myers was convicted of obstruction of justice conspiracy to conceal evidence, criminal enablement of child abuse, and witness tampering. The Lincoln County School Board was found civilly liable for gross negligence and systemic failure to protect its students. The financial award was historic $15 million in compensatory and punitive damages to Kayla Brooks and her family, and a further $10 million to establish a trust fund for other victims of Pierce's abuse, who might yet come forward, and to fund comprehensive reforms within the school district. Margaret Pierce, her face contorted with rage and disbelief, lunged forward screaming, "It's a lie, a complete fabrication. This is a setup, that manipulative charity case played you all. I am the victim here." But court officers swiftly restrained her, her venomous outburst only serving to solidify the image of her unrepentant cruelty. Ronald Myers, in contrast, simply slumped in his chair, a broken, deflated man, and the weight of his corruption finally crushing him. Outside the courthouse, a spontaneous cheer erupted from the crowd of supporters who had gathered daily, many of them holding signs that read, "I am Kayla," and "Justice for Kayla." Linda Brooks, her arm wrapped tightly around Kayla's small shoulders, simply whispered, "You did it, baby. You won. Not with noise, not with anger, but with your quiet truth, your unwavering dignity." Weeks later, a letter arrived at the Brooks' small house, postmarked from the state correctional facility where Margaret Pierce was beginning her lengthy sentence. It was not an apology. It was a single sheet of paper filled with Pierce's familiar sharp handwriting, a final venomous barb. "You may think you've won, little girl," it read, "but you're still just a charity case who got a lucky break. This world doesn't change that easily. The powerful always find a way. You'll see. Your 15 minutes of fame will end, and you'll still be nothing." Kayla read the letter once, twice, her expression unreadable. Then she carefully, deliberately folded it into a small square and tucked it away in the back of her sketchbook. It was just another piece of her past, another ugly scar, but now it was powerless to wound her further. She had faced her dragon, and she had not flinched. Months turned into a year. The Kayla's Light Art Academy, funded by a significant portion of the settlement money and a generous endowment from Ethan Cole, officially opened its doors in a beautifully renovated old warehouse building on the outskirts of Rose Hill. There was no ostentatious ribbon-cutting ceremony, no self-congratulatory speeches from politicians. Just the quiet hum of children's voices, the scratch of colored pencils on paper, the smell of paint and clay, and the bright, hopeful eyes of young people who had for too long been told their stories didn't matter. Children, many bearing their own invisible scars from poverty discrimination or the casual cruelties of an indifferent world, found solace expression and a sense of belonging within its welcoming walls. Kayla, now a poised and confident 13-year-old, moved among them not as a victim, not as a celebrity, but as a gentle, empathetic guide, a fellow artist. Her own hair had grown back a soft, dark halo around her face, but she often still wore bright, colorful headscarves, not as a covering, but as a statement of joyful self-expression. Her first painting completed at the academy was not of shadows or headless figures. It was a vast, sun-drenched room, its windows thrown wide open, vibrant curtains billowing in a gentle breeze, and a kaleidoscope of light streaming in, illuminating countless blank canvases waiting to be filled. One evening alone in the quiet studio, Kayla tacked a fresh canvas to her easel. She thought of Pierce's letter, the fears she'd felt during the threats, the shock of the courtroom betrayals. The shadows could still whisper. But she picked up a charcoal stick, then a brush dipped in fiery orange. She began to sketch not a victim, but a phoenix, its wings vast, rising from a pile of chalk dust and shattered clippers, its eyes bright with an unbreakable light. They tried to make me ashes, she thought, a small, determined smile playing on her lips as she worked. But they didn't know I could fly. Her own art exhibition, titled simply Me and Her, opened a year later at a prestigious downtown gallery. It was a critical and popular success. The centerpiece, the painting that drew the most gasps and silent tears, was a large canvas depicting a radiant, bald young girl. Kayla, as she was now strong and self-possessed, holding hands tenderly with a smaller, younger version of herself. The younger Kayla's wig was flying off in a gust of wind, her eyes closed, a single tear on her cheek. Yet her expression was one of dawning, peaceful release, as if she were finally being protected, finally being seen. Together, the two Kaylas walked hand in hand towards a brilliant, hopeful light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. At the exhibition opening, standing before a hushed, moved audience, Kayla, her voice clear and steady, said, "I used to believe that silence was safety, that if I made myself small enough, invisible enough, I wouldn't get hurt. But I learned that being silent for too long just lets other people write your story, define who you are. I paint not to be a famous artist, but to tell my own story in my own colors. And to say to myself and to anyone else who needs to hear it, I have nothing to hide. We have nothing to be ashamed of." Ethan Cole stood in a quiet corner of the gallery watching her, a rare, genuine smile gracing his usually stern features. Later, after the crowds had thinned and the reporters had finally dispersed, he stood beside Kayla in front of her powerful centerpiece painting. "You brought that little girl out of the darkness, Kayla," he said quietly, his voice filled with a profound, respectful admiration. "You truly did." Kayla nodded, her eyes, luminous, fixed on the image of her two selves united, healing. "She didn't deserve to be left behind in that darkness," she replied softly. "No one does." The 12-year-old girl who had been so brutally stripped of her dignity in the middle of her classroom had not only redrawn herself, she had redrawn her world, infusing it with light, courage, and an unwavering belief in the inherent worth of every single voice. And in doing so, she offered a radiant, enduring beacon of hope for every child everywhere who had ever been told they were less, that they didn't matter. For self-esteem, she now understood with every fiber of her being, is not a gift bestowed by others. It is a fortress built from within stone by painful stone, reclaimed and defended with the fiercest, quietest, most unbreakable courage. And dignity, once truly seen, once fully embraced, possesses the extraordinary power to illuminate not just a single life, but the entire world.